Good morning, everyone. Well, today's the day. Today is the day that the changes that are being required by this settlement go into effect. We have been talking about all of this for almost 5 months, and we really hope you've been paying attention and that you're ready for this. But just in case, we wanted to do this last video to help you understand what is happening and to address some of the questions we've been getting the most frequently asked. So what are the two big changes happening today? The biggest one, as far as the MLS system goes, is the compensation field has been removed. It's no longer there. And you cannot reference compensation in any way, shape, or form in the MLS system. So don't put it in private remarks, don't put it in an attached doc, it's gone. The second thing is that you will now be required to have a buyer rep agreement in place prior to showing, whether that's virtual or in person, a home. And the settlement defines a home as a residential property of 1 to 4 units. So those changes happen effective today. So talk to us about buyer rep agreements.
Buyer rep agreements, we've been talking about for a long time. These shouldn't feel like a brand new thing to you, but it's a contract you'll sign with your buyer prior to touring properties, like Tina just said. It needs to establish what type of property they're looking for. It needs to establish the fee you're charging for your services. And the biggest part of that is the fee needs to be readily ascertainable. So it can't be a variable such as whatever the other side is willing to offer. You could introduce some variables with it depending on the property type or the length of the search, but it needs to be something that could actually be calculated to make sense. It can't just be this vague, I hope I get paid once we're done looking for houses.
Right. So what buyer rep agreement should you be using? Well, there's multiple choices out there. Oregon Realtors has a buyer rep agreement in their library of forms. Oregon Real Estate Forms has one in their library. Oregon Data Share did not create a buyer rep agreement just because so many already were. And we also heard that a lot of firms were creating their own. So we did not create one, but we did put out an advisory of not only the terms that you have to have in one, but the terms that you should consider whether or not you want to have in one. So you can find that in the forms that are on Flex MLS. We're not going to be adding that to the forms library because it isn't actually a form, it's just an advisory. So if you go to, in the menu in Flex MLS, go to MLS Intranet, and then you'll see different drop downs, and it's in those forms. So
Intranet, that's fancy.
It isn't fancy,
80s.
Yeah. Not internet, intranet.
A lot of brokerages have developed their own forms. One question that's come up, or I suppose a valid concern, is say you meet someone at an open house or you pick up an online lead and you say, here, this is my buyer representation agreement. You need to sign this before we can look at the house. It lasts for 2 years. Not everybody may want to do that. You can introduce some variations on this if you want to. If it's an online lead, and you could say, well, I need to send you this buyer rep agreement before we can look at the house. That's just the rules. They can argue with you if they want to, but you need to have it. But you can make it for that specific house. You can use that as an opportunity for an interview and say, let's meet, let's discuss my services, and go through the home. And then if we get along, great, sign a longer one. Mm-hmm. It's someone who's coming into town. They're going to be here for a long weekend. Great, sign it for 5 days. They want a probationary period. Sign it for a month. We're not locked into this idea that once we have a buyer rep agreement, this lasts into eternity and there's no other options. Right. Even at an open house, if they come in, we've discussed the fact you're representing the seller, right? And they need to be aware of that. But then they say, hey, we love this house. You know so much about it. Could you help me write an offer? You say, yes, I got to change hats now. I was the seller's agent, now I'm going to be a buyer's agent. We need to talk about my services and what I charge. You could literally write a buyer's rep agreement for 12 hours for one property. And then hopefully you're going to connect with them and sign a longer buyer's rep agreement if that doesn't work. But we don't need to put this heavy-handed requirement on new clients right off the bat. There's ways to make this really approachable. And just explaining to them this exists so that there's an understanding of the fees right from the beginning and there's not these surprises or agents, dear God, hopefully not still saying that working with them as a buyer's agent doesn't cost you anything.
Right, yeah, which is a big part of why we ended up where we are. is because we were not very good at explaining how buyer's agents get paid. So the purpose of the buyer rep agreements is to help buyers really understand how you as a buyer's agent get paid and the vast array of services you will offer far and above just opening a door and filling out a form.
Right.
And bear in mind, they don't even need to be exclusive. You could do a non-exclusive agreement. And there's really, the options are kind of endless. Because you might be working with somebody who's looking for property either here or in Bend, for example, and you know nothing about the Bend market, so you could have them sign one with you that's just for Jackson and Josephine counties, and then they could go up to Bend and sign an agreement with somebody up there just for Deschutes County, for example. So really the options are kind of endless, and you just really need to check with your managing broker as to what they want you to do.
If someone's shopping for a house in Hermiston, I'm not helping them.
Right.
Sorry, guys.
So continuing along the lines of forms and what those mean, do you want to touch on the changes to the sale agreements?
Yeah, so a couple of updates to the ORIF and the OR sale agreements regarding how commission is addressed. Now, again, as we've mentioned from the beginning, it's really important to note the buyer can make an offer contingent on the seller or the listing agent covering all or part of a buyer's agent's fee. It's no different than them saying, we want to buy your house if you leave us the fridge, or we want to buy your house if you give us closing costs, or if you buy us a free puppy, right? Buyer can negotiate whatever they want as long as it's not illegal. Us as agents cannot say, hey, we have an offer that our clients want us to present, but we won't do it unless you agree to this fee. That's where the conflict of interest comes into play. Mm-hmm. So both form sets have actually simplified this quite a bit. If you're looking at the ORIF forms, residential sale agreement, Section 8, it's all of 2 lines. Is buyer requesting seller contributions towards buyer's expenses in this transaction? Yes or no? And then if the answer is no, congratulations, you can move on. If the answer is yes, you include ORIF Form 048. This is the seller contributions addendum. This is twofold. So it'll tackle closing costs as we've done for a very long time. And we all know it's not uncommon to negotiate closing costs into an offer. It adds a separate line for total buyer's agent's compensation coming from the seller. So if there is a co-op compensation being offered by the listing agent that counts towards the total fee agreed to in the buyer's representation agreement, you would only put the amount in here that's required to make up the difference. So this is indicating what the seller is contributing, because again, agents are not party to this contract. If we have a contract for a fee agreement, it's between the two of us.
Right.
Buyer and seller aren't involved. If there's no co-op compensation being offered, then it would be whatever amount the buyer wants to request. Again, that will go towards covering the amount agreed to in the fee agreement. We'll address later what to do with the dynamic of brokerage to brokerage fee agreements, but for now we're just talking about negotiations between buyer and seller. So again, ORIF forms, are they requesting seller contributions, yes or no? That one-page addendum, how much contribution are they requesting? Yeah. I think OR forms has simplified this even further, actually, by removing the need for an additional addendum. It's simply on the first page of the offer. Section 4, 4F indicates if the seller is going to pay any fees to the buyer's brokerage. 4G is informational only. This is where there's a reference to a brokerage to brokerage fee agreement. Again, it's not binding in this contract because that's an agreement between brokers. It's simply making a reference to the fact that such an agreement exists. And then 4H is total brokerage fees to be paid by the seller and the seller's agent's firm combined. So you got a total amount here, and it could be split up between the seller and the seller's brokerage, or just one or the other. But it's really simple just to put on that one line. It's just important to remember 4G references an agreement. It is not an agreement in and of itself. And then 4I is just other closing costs, which again, we do all the time anyway.
So to clarify, you have a buyer rep agreement with somebody for X. You call up the listing agent and you ask, is there any compensation being offered, you find out that, yeah, it's Y, and Y happens to be less than X.
Right.
So then and your buyer then decides, yes, we want to write an offer on that house. So then your buyer could ask the seller to make up the difference between what is coming from the listing firm and what you have agreed to with your buyer for your buyer rep agreement.
Right.
And that's what that would be used for.
Right.
The two different lines.
Right. Two
Okay.
separate lines, and it just needs to equal the total of what they're requesting. Not to complicate things.
Right.
In theory, maybe the buyer has enough to cover part of the fee
Right.
up front, and the listing brokerage is offering part of the fee, and the buyer wants to request the seller make up the difference.
Right.
I mean, the difference could be
There's going to be
$10,
yes, a
you know.
multitude of variations in all of this.
Yeah, part of the problem is people are asking, well, what do we do in this case? The number of potential scenarios are as many as the number of agents we have,
Right.
or, I mean, even more than that, the number of transactions we
Right.
do. We all
Yeah.
know transactions are unique. So we're going to find a routine that is most common.
Yeah.
But just like it is now, it's not like there's just one size fits all and we never deviate from
Right.
that practice.
Right.
So,
Well, and I think Mike just touched on a really key point, is the fact that the buyer agent compensation is essentially now going to become a negotiated part of every single deal. Whereas right now, it's not. It's just a flat fee that's offered in the MLS. And now it's going to become a negotiated part of every deal.
right. Well, and if that fee offered in the MLS was higher, groovy, we just got a bonus. We didn't do any extra work for it. If it was lower, I mean, most of the time we just ate it and that's what it was.
Yeah.
So this isn't all bad or all good. It's just a slight shift.
Right. Yeah, and you just brought up something going back to the buyer broker agreements. So the settlement says that you cannot accept more than what you have agreed to. And as he mentioned, if the MLS was offering less than maybe what you had agreed to, you would just eat it. So now you're going to have to go back to your buyers and have those conversations. If it's less than, you need to talk to the buyer about whether or not you're willing to reduce your fee or whether you expect them to make up the difference. And if it is more, again, you have to go back to the buyer and have the conversation of whether or not you're going to amend your agreement with them for a higher fee. And if it's a complicated deal or maybe an unrepresented seller, there may be justification for that.
Yeah.
But in most cases, your conversation with your buyer is going to be, okay, how do you want to use that extra percentage to make your offer look that much better?
Right.
So
Another thing that's worth noting is both of these form sets do not facilitate brokerage to brokerage compensation. I said we're still going to tackle that later, like I said, but neither of these are providing a method for two agents to sign a fee agreement, and that was done intentionally. The DOJ doesn't like that. They would like it to go away. It's still legal,
yes.
but as a little bit of a risk mitigation, they haven't incorporated that into their form sets. Doesn't mean your brokerage can't develop one.
So tagging on to Mike's point, the settlement prohibits MLSs specifically from facilitating co-op compensation, which is when the listing broker shares a portion of their commission with the buyer broker. That's co-op compensation. It prohibits us from facilitating that in any way, shape, or form. So not only did we have to take the field out of the MLS, we had to take any reference to it out of any forms we provide. OREF and OR are not MLSs, but they elected to take it out of their forms as a risk mitigation piece for themselves, as Mike mentioned. So it is still perfectly legal in the state of Oregon to do it that way. It's written into state law. So you can still do it that way if you want that to be your business model. You'll just have to come up with your own forms, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, ask your brokerage what their plan is for it.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're going to be reviewed by an attorney. Lots of us use our own forms in our brokerages for specific things, so it's not like this is a earth-shattering
Right.
development.
right.
One question I've heard come up a couple times that frankly I'm not really sure it's going to be a significant concern. You have a buyer's representation agreement. They say that they're not going to negotiate it into the offer. You get into contract, you're coming up on closing, and then the buyer says, oh, well, I actually don't have that much money. Sorry. Mm-hmm. And so I just don't get paid. I mean, yeah, I guess there's a scenario where that could happen. Our buyer's representation agreement is not binding escrow instructions. So all you would have to do is have a commission demand or some sort of instruction signed by the buyer's agent and the buyer, because they're the only two people party to that agreement, and have that submitted to escrow. As long as escrow has instructions, they have to follow them. It's not an option. So if you have those instructions signed and submitted to escrow, it's the same as loan costs. A buyer can't just get to the closing table and say, oh, shoot, sorry, lender, I actually don't have the closing costs I thought I had. Escrow doesn't shrug their shoulders and close it anyway and say, oh, sucks for the lender. No, they can't close the transaction because the buyer doesn't have the funds to close. If our commission agreements, if our fee agreements are submitted to escrow the appropriate way, those are part of the cost to close that loan. And without that those funds, the loan doesn't close. So don't go down the doomsday rabbit hole. I mean, yes, there's going to be some hiccups in this, but again, like, I don't think the whole world is imploding.
Yeah.
Probably, hopefully.
Yeah. No. It is going to be a dust storm for a while, but we will eventually find a new rhythm and a new normal.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's going to take that long, actually. So, well, there will, you have hiccups today. So these will just be maybe a slightly different kind of hiccup than what you've had before. And keep in mind that the buyer rep agreement itself is a legally binding agreement. So even if you don't go down the escrow route, like Mike just mentioned, you would still have a legally binding agreement that you could, take them to small claims court or whatever over, and they would not have a leg to stand on since they signed the agreement. So
yeah, I mean, I don't want to be the guy who sees my clients a lot, but
no.
If you find yourself in circumstances on a regular basis where you randomly have clients trying to back out at the last minute, you might want to vet your clients a little better. We have a couple other changes, Tina. One of them you were a big part of.
Oh, the Oregon Data Share Listing Agreement, yes.
Changes to listing agreements.
Yeah. So the Oregon Data Share, which is the partnership between Southern Oregon Multiple Listing Service, the MLS of Central Oregon, and Klamath County Multiple Listing Service, we revised the listing agreement and came out with a new one. Good news is it's now only 4 pages long.
Woo!
We shortened it.
It's 20% shorter.
Right. And again, it got rid of the offer of co-op compensation because we cannot facilitate that for you guys anymore. So what it does now in sections 5A and 5B, it uncouples the compensation. So 5A is what the seller will pay a listing agent, and it's just the fee to the listing agent. 5B then touches on the buyer brokerage fee for the seller to pay that directly. And there's 2 different options there. One is additional compensation, if any, to be offered to the brokerage representing the buyer. So if an agent from a whole other brokerage brings the buyer, or even someone else within your own firm, that's the amount that it will be paid. And then there's a second option that says additional compensation, if any, to listing firm, if same individual broker at listing firm works with both seller and buyer. Now, since this got released, the number one question I've gotten is, we need an option for an unrepresented buyer. Well, actually, number 2 covers both unrepresented buyers or you double ending it. That's why it says works with, not represents. So that would be the fee that covers both those scenarios. And keep in mind that does not presume dual agency is, you still have to follow the getting consent for dual agency to happen. This is just your conversation with your seller of, if this were to happen and if you agreed to it, this is the compensation that would get paid.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's why it says works with and not represents, because that is intended to cover both scenarios. And then there's a spot right below that where the seller can initial if they're not wanting to offer a preset fee, and whether they are or are not willing to entertain offers asking for a fee. So that might be a case where a seller wants to say, hey, I don't want to preset something. Let's just see what people ask for. I'm willing to consider paying one.
Right.
Well, let's just see what they ask for. So that would be a spot for them to initial. And keep in mind that even if a seller marks that they are not willing to entertain offers, that doesn't mean you can't present offers that come in asking for it. Because people can still ask for whatever they want. Like Mike said, they could ask for a puppy. That doesn't mean that the seller's going to be willing to do it. So that is just an indication of what the seller is thinking at this moment. As we all know, good enough offer comes in,
Right.
they're going to change their mind. So.
Well, and I think you touched on not only if the seller says they're not willing to entertain offers, requesting seller to pay the buyer brokerage fee, not only can you still present offers if you receive them, you actually must present offers.
Yes.
In Oregon, we are required to present all written offers to our sellers.
Yes.
No matter how bad they are. Most of us have done that at some point.
Yeah.
We still present them.
Yeah.
And I think a really important clarification, because Tina mentioned we got rid of co-op compensation being facilitated by the MLS. If you go back to, I think it was March, we did a video on the different ways commission can flow.
Mm-hmm.
Chris did a really fancy graph. I think he made it with MS Paint. The key difference here, the money all winds up in the same place, but the way it's shuffled around matters significantly according to this structure. So the way this facilitates the option for a buyer's broker to get paid through the transaction is directly from the seller. So remember, we got buyer's agent, listing agent, buyer, seller. The commission is going from the seller to the buyer's agent. It is not flowing through the listing brokerage, which is how we avoid that co-op compensation concern.
Yep. Yep.
And then we have a few changes to the Oregon Realtors listing agreement. Similar to the MLS one, it's completely isolated the two different sides of the potential fees. One of them is the brokerage fee for the listing agent shall be equal to X. That's pretty straightforward. There's a second line. If this box is checked and the buyer is unrepresented, the brokerage fee shall be equal to X. So it gives you the option for an unrepresented buyer and what you're charging for the listing. They took it a step further than ODS even though. There's an option to say whether or not the seller will or will not consider offers requesting a buyer's broker fee to be included. Period. There's
Okay.
no facilitation of will the seller offer anything, what
Right.
amount.
No amounts.
Simply says the seller will or will not consider this. So they've taken even another step back and just said, we're not going to play at all. We're just going to give you the ability to communicate if it'll be considered.
And that goes back to what we talked about earlier, is that this is going to become a negotiated part of every transaction. You know, you and I have been saying for 5 months, think of this in terms of other conditions that you guys negotiate all day, every day. You know, you don't write into the listing agreement, you know, necessarily roof repairs or carpet allowances or those kinds of things.
Right.
But you look at offers asking for those all the time.
Right.
And so that's part of why OR decided to take theirs completely out, because they see this as becoming something that is negotiated in every single deal.
Yeah, and that's...
And the way ODS did it, keep in mind that because it is worded as the seller is offering that, that is not a legally binding thing. That is just the seller saying, I'm willing to pay this, and giving the listing agent authorization to communicate that to buyer's agents who ask, but until it's written into a sale agreement, it's not legally binding. So you guys need to make sure that you are writing that if the seller is offering compensation directly to the buyer's agent, that needs to be written into the offers.
Right. And then the final method that we haven't really discussed. So we've got if the buyer is going to pay it directly without putting it into the transaction, have that fee agreement submitted to escrow. So it's part of their instructions. If the seller is going to cover it through the proceeds, then you have that written into the offer. The third way, the way that we've been doing it for quite a while, is brokerage to brokerage. None of these form sets offer a brokerage to brokerage fee agreement. I think people are probably understandably shying away from that. So just ask your brokerage, what form do we have for that? If both managing principal brokers sign it, that is a binding fee agreement. You can also submit that to escrow, so it'll indicate, hey, this has to get paid. This is how they're going to divide the money. One thing I want to reiterate that we've talked about several times is I think we need to stop talking about this in such simple terms. Oh, the buyer pays it. Oh, the seller pays it. Oh, the listing agent pays it. we're all putting something into a big pool here. Buyers bring in a boatload of cash, sellers bring in a house. We're going to come to terms on how they want to divide that up. So yes, if the seller's going to pay it, my argument is, where did the seller get the money from? I'm selling a house for $500,000. Who gave the seller the money with which to pay those commissions? Your buyer did.
And it doesn't happen unless there is a successful deal closed.
Yeah. So if
Right.
we can understand this, I think, in a better way and say, look, this is all part of a successful transaction where multiple
Yeah.
parties are bringing assets and multiple parties are getting something out of it, it feels a little less awkward and contentious and,
Yep.
and just makes it like, oh, we are all working towards the same goal.
Yep.
Yes, I realize we're negotiating against each other if we're on other sides of a deal, but only to a certain extent. If you're negotiating for the sake of taking advantage of somebody, you're probably not approaching it the right way. If the
Right.
buyer wants to buy and the seller wants to sell and we're helping them do that, we are working towards the same end goal.
Right. And I've heard several people say they're going to stop calling it commission and start calling it a professional service fee, which actually makes a lot of sense. Not telling you what you have to do, but just throwing that out there as an idea.
Yeah.
One of the things, as Mike mentioned, if you're still going to do the co-op compensation model, or if you're receiving a payment that way, you do need to have a fee agreement. And per state law, that fee agreement has to be signed and in place prior to you presenting the offer. And you may say, well, I don't have to do that now. Why do I have to do it? Because right now the MLS acts as that legally binding contractual offer. The MLS is your fee agreement. With that field going away, the fee agreement also goes away. So if you want a legally binding fee agreement in place, you're going to have to do a separate form. And unfortunately, we can't facilitate that. So you have to talk to your managing broker about what form. And if you are a managing broker, talk to your attorney.
It may seem trivial until the first time you forget to sign it before an
Right.
offer, and maybe someone on the other
Yeah.
end is feeling a little feisty, and they go, never mind, we decided not to offer it. You'll remember to get it signed preemptively real quick after that.
Yeah.
But there's nothing wrong with that model. Our model is structured because it is what's best for consumers.
Yep.
We benefited from it. It was nice to not have to think about it. But fact is, it brings the most potential buyers to the table for a seller, and it provides the greatest opportunities for buyers to get into a home, particularly low income, minorities, first-time home buyers. So there's a reason it developed that way. All that being said, I don't expect the brokerage to brokerage fee agreement will be the most typical manner going forward, if for no other reason than the fact that the forms don't facilitate that. So anyone getting into the industry who hasn't done things before the settlement, they're just going to follow the paperwork that they have. And over time, people who've been doing it for long enough will either change their routines or retire.
Exactly. I think a key thing to remember as a listing agent is you desperately need to explain to your seller why it is still in their best interest to offer some kind of a buyer brokerage fee. Because if they do not, the vast majority of buyers are not going to be able to even consider that property. Because as you guys know, the vast majority of buyers barely have their down payment scraped together, much less an additional, $10,000, $15,000 or whatever it may be, depending on the cost of the home. So it is still very much in the seller's best interest to offer a buyer broker fee. Do they have to preset the amount? No, but I think just communicating to them that, if you're absolutely refusing to do anything at all, that's fine, that's your prerogative, but recognize that you are dramatically limiting the pool of buyers that can consider your property.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before. Approach it as to what's best for the consumer. Not what is going to make other agents like you the most, not what is going to ensure that we get paid this most easily, but what's best for the consumer. Generally speaking, it will be in the seller's best interest. If you're in a circumstance where it's not, great, help them understand that, and don't do it. That's fine. It's just like
you actually could do that today, even though you rarely saw it.
No, it didn't happen often, but it's the leaky roof example you guys are all sick of hearing me talk about. If the roof is leaking, it's probably in the seller's best interest to fix it. That's going to bring the most potential buyers and financing options for the property. but they don't have to. And, frankly, there may be circumstances where it's not worth the seller fixing because they're selling cash only as is because there's a ton of other things going on anyway.
Right.
So there could be circumstances where it's in the seller's best interest to not offer any compensation.
Yes.
And that's also fine as long as the discussion has been had and the pros and cons have been addressed and the seller's deciding, I'd like to say based on what's best for them. Some people are stubborn, so maybe just based on what they want, but at least they knew their options.
Yeah. So circling back around to the compensation in the MLS. So the field is going away. You cannot put it in the private remarks, and don't try and get creative and figure out a different way to word it. We're already seeing that happening. Bonus points to people for creativity, but we're still going to make you take it out. And you cannot reference any bonuses being paid. No, do not reference any money going to a buyer broker in any way, shape, or form in the MLS. What you can do is put into the private remarks if your seller is offering any kind of credits, or if they're putting money towards carpet allowance or roof repair or whatever it is, you can definitely put that in the private remarks, but it cannot be limited to buyer agent compensation only or reference the buyer agent compensation anyway. So you could have a blanket statement of seller offering X in buyer credits. Fine, no problem. As long as it's up to the buyer what they use that for.
Can we offer puppies?
You can.
Sweet.
Because that's not money.
The offer, it's not the same as a unilateral offer of compensation, right? This is just something to communicate a seller's willingness. I would encourage you, though, eyes are on us. DOJ already launched an additional probe into the California Association of Realtors for some language in their forms. If you're going to do that, don't put a flat percentage that is just clearly a substitution for how we've done things in the past. There is a change, okay? Love it, hate it, whatever. Things are changing. Accept it. Adjust as necessary. So if you're going to use that as a negotiating tool, that's fine. But don't do this like super transparent trying to skirt the rules.
Right.
You're not going to get away with it.
Yeah, exactly. And we as the MLS, we have to be monitoring this. We don't have a choice. And so we are, if you try to skirt it, we are going to find it. We're going to make you take it out. And if you keep trying to do the same thing, you will start getting fined. We have to. So I'm sure you guys have questions that we haven't touched on. Please don't hesitate to call or email the MLS office, info@roguevalleyrealtors.org, or give us a phone call. We're happy to answer questions. I'll refer you to FACTS, FACTS, not FAX, FACTS.realtor. There's a very lengthy FAQ that answers a lot of the questions. There's also resources there that you can share with your clients, both buyers and sellers, to explain what's going on. And Mike and I have been doing, since March 15th, we've been doing videos and putting out different resources for you as well. So refer back to the weekly emails. Specifically refer you back to the email from July 29th, where the whole email was settlement-related resources, and gives you a good wealth of information. So
yeah, this is a shift, guys. We've been talking about it for a long time.
Yep.
Yeah, it's annoying, but it's not the craziest thing that's probably ever happened. It's not going to be the last hurdle we have to figure out how to get over. But we're going to keep doing our jobs.
Exactly.
And we're going to keep helping people, buy and sell houses and make these huge investments where they raise their kids and they retire.
Yeah.
That's why we do what we do.
I mean, it's the foundation. Get a little, intellectual here for a second, but it's the foundation of America. I mean, we all heard in school the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness thing, but the original language was life, liberty, and property.
Oh, I didn't know
It
that.
is the foundation of America that we're built on. So the right to own property is a quintessential thing that we are going to continue to protect, we're going to continue to facilitate, and we're going to continue to help people realize the American dream.
Yeah.
So onward and upward, everybody.